welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. On this month's edition of Other Voices, where we usually look at what's going on in the headlines, we're going to take a look behind the headlines and how news is reported in this country, why certain reports come out the way they do, and why some journalists are under threat of imprisonment by the current administration. To help us understand both sides of this journalistic coin, we're very pleased to welcome Ted Glasser, who is professor of communication at Stanford University. Ted, welcome to Other Voices. Glad to have you here.
Good to be here.
Ted was for 14 years the director of the Stanford Graduate Program in Journalism, and he's currently the chair of the board of the Stanford Daily Publishing Company, which publishes the Stanford Daily, the student newspaper. He's also been active with a lot of organizations dedicated to education in journalism and many interests. Ted's teaching and research focuses on media practices and performance, responsibilities, and that sort of thing, and he's co-authored or edited a number of books on these topics. So I couldn't think of a better guest to have. I called you the day that Glenn Greenwald's partner found himself in custody of the British authorities. I thought, this is something we need to talk about. So before we dive into that, though, the topic of the day, we should try to address this. All the headlines are talking about Syria. We've got a petition going to Congress right now. The president has asked Congress to authorize the use of force in Syria, and hopefully where you can sign up online is on your screen. It's at peaceandjustice.org/petition/Congress. Could you just start us off for a few minutes? What are your observations generally on how the media is doing in covering the Syria story?
Yeah, I think the Syria coverage that we see, especially in the mainstream press, I don't think surprises anyone. It's very event-driven. It's very conflict-oriented. It's very much defined. The terms of the debate is very much defined by the status quo, which is to say the Republicans versus the Democrats, what we can and can't do. It's a missed opportunity to explore any number of issues, and it's a missed opportunity to invite sources to comment who often are unheard of or unavailable to the American press. And I'll just give you
unknown to the American press.
Well, they're known. They're just ignored,
yeah.
And systematically so. And there are reasons for that. I mean, if you understand the logic of American journalism, the range of acceptable sources is very limited. But let me just give you one example of a missed opportunity for a debate that we really ought to be having now, and that is the viability of the World Court. The World Court is seldom cited as an option, as opposed to going in with troops, as opposed to going in with cruise missiles. Why can't something like this be taken to the World Court? Well, part of the answer to that question is the United States doesn't take the World Court very seriously. Since the mid-1980s, the United States has decided it was going to respond to the World Court on an ad hoc basis only, which is to say it would ignore the court when the court dealt with issues the United States didn't want the court to deal with. And the U.S. response to the World Court is not unlike the U.S. response to UNESCO. When UNESCO does things the United States doesn't like, the United States pulls out its funding from UNESCO, which makes UNESCO virtually unworkable. In fact, we need to look carefully and critically at the whole structure of the United Nations. The United Nations was created following World War II in an era where communism was what terrorism is today. It was the Cold War era. The Security Council might have made some sense then, but it's a fundamentally undemocratic institution, the Security Council, particularly with its veto. And so is the World Court, to the extent that 5 nations, or any one of 5 nations, can veto what the World Court does, what the World Court rules. So it seems to me that the Syria conflict and other conflicts in the Middle East not only needs to be put in the context of the Middle East and U.S. policies toward the Middle East in general, not simply with regard to Syria, but why is it that we didn't do anything in response to the coup in Egypt? Indeed, why is it that we don't describe the coup in Egypt as a coup? And we'll talk about that later in the program, yeah. I hope, when we talk about the absence of independent journalism. And so I want to distinguish between independent journalism and free journalism. You can be free but not independent, which is a point any number of commentators have made over the years. But my point here is that there's much to be debated that's not being debated with regard to Syria and other roles the United States plays in the world, and part of that has to do with how serious the United States is to the democratic principles it espouses, and how fundamentally undemocratic the U.S. policy is toward the World Court and the United Nations in general. That's a mouthful of a response.
Well, and it's a good place to start, and will launch us into all these other topics. I do want to just relate a personal story about the World Court. Back in the late 80s, I worked for Quest for Peace, and we were shipping humanitarian aid to Nicaragua in defiance of the U.S. embargo against the Sandinistas. And I was in Washington for an organizing meeting with one of the other national organizers there, and he happened to know an attorney who worked for the United States presenting cases at the World Court. And in fact, had been telling me about her the night before, and that she had just been there, something that the United States had brought against Iran. Mm-hmm. Well, we ran into her downtown, and he said, well, what are you working on now? She said, well, I'm arguing against Nicaragua in the World Court. Nicaragua was suing the United States for mining its harbors. The position of the United States when Nicaragua sued us was that the World Court had no jurisdiction. No jurisdiction. World Court. Anyway, excellent point. It's not being talked about. There's the International Criminal Court, the World Court. There's the United Nations General Assembly, which is often overlooked as well. So let's take this a step at a time. Here in this country, in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the guarantee of a free press is right there. And it's taken to be one of our most valuable rights. And I know in looking up material for you, I came across the fact that you helped organize a conference on freedom of the press just a few months ago, and asking some good questions at this conference. What does it mean? Where does it apply? And what it requires. So let's spend a few minutes on what came out of this conference. This sounds really interesting.
Well, part of the conference was focused on freedom of the press in the 21st century, which is to say, how do we respond to the new digital landscape? What are the implications for a free press? But we kept returning to some basic, fundamental questions about what we mean in the United States by a free press. And we spent some time talking about the distinction between freedom for the press and freedom of the press, and how the First Amendment ought to be interpreted, which is not a technical legal question for the Supreme Court, but rather a larger social political question that we all need to be concerned with. And let me see if I can unravel that distinction a bit, because I think you'll find it interesting and certainly important.
Yeah, please.
When we talk about freedom of the press, we're talking about a constitutional right we all enjoy. We're all entitled to freedom of the press. When we talk about freedom for the press, we're talking about an institutional right, a freedom we extend to journalists, to this thing we call the press, however it gets defined. Traditionally, historically, in the United States, we have rejected the second interpretation. We've said more or less, there's no such thing as freedom for the press, there's only freedom of the press. And it's an interpretation I'm inclined to embrace, in the sense that I find it far more democratic than protecting an institution in ways we wouldn't protect ordinary citizens. And it also avoids creating a bifurcated or two-tier First Amendment, a First Amendment that applies to you and me and a First Amendment that applies to journalists. And we see this distinction playing itself out now in the debate about whether we should have a federal shield law. A shield law is a law that protects the confidentiality, the promises of confidentiality that journalists make to their sources. It's a testimonial privilege. It's a testimonial privilege not unlike the testimonial privilege we eagerly give to physicians and clergy and lawyers, and for all the good obvious reasons, right? No one's going to confide in their physician if they're worried about a physician revealing that information. No one's going to talk candidly to a lawyer about his or her predicament if they're worried about a lawyer being compelled to reveal that testimony.
And same with confession.
That's right, and same with clergy, right? No one's going to confess, right, to a priest if you were worried about the priest having to testify. So the same logic, it's been argued, ought to apply to journalists who clearly need confidential sources. And we could talk about the importance of confidential sources, but without confidential sources, the day's news would be reduced to essentially handouts. There wouldn't be much of a distinction between public relations and journalism without confidential sources. Without me being able to say to you, tell me what you really know, you don't have to put your job in jeopardy. Tell me what you know, you don't need to risk public humiliation or shame or whatever the consequences might be of revealing that information. So I think you can make a compelling case for the importance of pledges of confidentiality in journalism. And yet at the same time, I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that ought to be a First Amendment right. Because if it's a First Amendment right, we are necessarily and always inviting the state to define who is and who is not a journalist. We're inviting the state to define who is the press and who is not the press. And those are precisely the kinds of questions I don't want the state responding to. I don't want the state to decide that I'm a journalist and you're not.
Right.
I don't want the state to decide that I'm entitled to special constitutional protection and you're not. I'd rather have the First Amendment understood as giving us all the same rights. Now, it's a little different than the debate that concerns priests and lawyers and physicians, because being a physician, being a lawyer, being a priest, for example, or a rabbi, is not a right, it's a privilege. Right? And the state extends that privilege to those people in a codified way, which is to say, I know precisely, it's a little less clear in the area of religion, but I know precisely who's a physician and who's a lawyer. They're licensed by the state. The state gives them the authority to be a physician. I can't take a knife and cut somebody open and say, it's okay, I'm a physician, right? The state has to sanction it. The state has to say, I am a qualified, legitimate, authentic physician in the sense that I passed the medical exam, I went to med school, whatever the requirements the state might have, and those change over time. But the state authorizes me to cut you open with a knife. The state authorizes me to represent you in court. But there is no state authorization for journalism. And I would suggest we don't want state authorization for journalism. Therefore, we don't want the state to get in the business of defining who's a journalist and who's not. Journalism shouldn't be a privilege. The First Amendment shouldn't be a privilege. The First Amendment needs to be understood as a right. Journalism needs to be understood as a right. So in the Shield Law debate, I'm very much opposed to a federal Shield Law, which makes it sound as though I'm opposed to privileges for journalists. I'm not. I just don't want those privileges grounded in the First Amendment. And in fact, the Supreme Court said long ago, this goes back to the early 1970s, that there's no First Amendment right to a testimonial privilege. Journalists just keep ignoring it and resisting it and pretending it doesn't exist, but it does. And in fact, the Court of Appeals this summer upheld that logic, that ruling, in its arguments against James Risen from the New York Times, saying, look, we're going to give you every benefit of the doubt when it comes to your pledges of confidentiality, but in the end, if we can't get this information in any other way, you're going to have to testify like any other citizen is going to have to testify, and I'm okay with that. I'm not opposed to journalists being compelled to testify. I am opposed to the federal government turning to journalists first as their easy and comfortable means of gaining testimony, that other things ought to be tried first, because a free press is something we want to preserve.
How do you tell, in that case, let's use James Risen, that the government has exhausted all its possibilities
I don't know.
to determine this information?
I don't know.
And that's the basis that they're using
Yeah.
to compel Risen, a New York Times
Right.
reporter, to go before a grand jury.
Yeah, and
if he refuses to protect, in order to protect his source, he's going to jail.
And it's curious, that's right, and the New York Times will be held in contempt as well. And it gets very expensive for both the reporter and the New York Times. The New York Times can afford it. Most reporters can't, and many newspapers can't afford $5,000, $10,000 a day contempt citations. I don't know the particular details of the trial, so I don't know whether all other means have been exhausted, but it's curious. The New York Times, I don't know about Risen, but the New York Times is in favor of a federal Shield Law. But if you read the drafts of the federal Shield Law, the ones that are in the House and in the Senate, they both make exemptions. They're not absolute privileges, they're qualified privileges, which is to say, even if the federal Shield Law was enacted, it's my understanding that, it's my interpretation of the Shield Law, that Risen would be going to jail anyway. Huh. And I have yet to hear...
Because there's language about this, if there's no other way to get the information.
Right.
And the idea of that is that they're investigating crimes. And in this case, the former CIA agent who apparently leaked information to Risen is being executed or prosecuted. Let's hope not executed. Prosecuted under the
Right.
1917
Espionage
Espionage.
Act. That's right. But you know, to make clear what the consequences of a lack of testimony might mean, imagine how you would feel if you were on trial for a crime that was witnessed by a reporter, and the reporter's testimony could exonerate you, and the reporter refused to testify. You know, how would you feel?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might wonder, well, what's First Amendment versus what? Sixth Amendment. It's the Constitution versus the Constitution. It's the Sixth Amendment that guarantees us a right to a fair and public trial. How fair a trial can you have unless you can call people to testify on your behalf, especially people who might exonerate you? So there are competing interests. It's not simply a matter of protecting a free press. There are other state interests. There are other social and political interests. And I would suggest, and I imagine most of you would agree, that a fair trial is a pretty compelling interest in the United States and in other countries. And if the conditions for fairness aren't being met, we need to ask ourselves, what can we do to improve those conditions? And one way to undermine those conditions is to extend testimonial privileges to the point where lots of people can claim that they have no obligation to testify. Without people testifying, it's the beginning of the end of the idea of a fair trial, if people can opt out of testimony. And I'm not saying that journalists are willy-nilly about that. They take the Sixth Amendment very seriously. But it's curious that when you talk about the Risson case and the New York Times case, I've heard the New York Times support a federal shield law, but I've yet to hear the New York Times come forward and say, if our reporters are compelled to testify under a federal shield law, they will not go to jail, they will testify. So I wonder what it means when the New York Times says they support a federal shield law. They seem to be supporting an absolute privilege for journalists, not a qualified privilege. And the shield laws almost always include, in fact they always include, a qualified privilege, not an absolute privilege.
How does the law resolve this conflict of constitutional rights when it comes to, say, a doctor's privilege? Would a doctor who held the final key to some kind of criminal investigation be compelled to testify?
Yes,
Do you know?
that's easier in the sense that there's no constitutional right to be a doctor. So it's not it's a statutory or a common law,
which was the point
against the Constitution.
Right.
And when the common law or statutory law is stacked up against the Constitution always wins. What makes the shield law controversy so interesting in some cases is it's the Constitution versus the Constitution, the First Amendment versus the Sixth Amendment. And then the courts are in that very difficult position of having to decide under what conditions does the Sixth Amendment prevail. This is the free press, fair trial debate that's gone on for decades concerning pretrial publicity, concerning changes of venue. There are countries in the world, for example, that prohibit reporters from covering trials, so that trials are allowed to be more fair than they would be if they were covered. That's not to say you can't attend the trial. It's to say that coverage can't take place until the trial's over.
Before we leave this topic, don't some states have shield laws?
Yes, most states do. And almost all states have, in fact, all states have definitions that are by definition exclusive, which is to say we exclude people from protection. And that's exactly the First Amendment argument I'm trying to get away from. I'm trying to get the state out of the business of defining who's a journalist and who's not. California defines it, and they almost always define journalism in a way that privileges the status quo. It privileges the legacy press. It privileges the mainstream press. Who does it exclude? It excludes the unconventional journalist. It excludes the journalist who's part-time. It excludes the freelance writer. It excludes the very people who need the protection the most in many cases. All right, I'm less worried about the New York Times. I'm more concerned with somebody who's never written for the New York Times getting the same constitutional protection that the reporters for the New York Times get.
There was a case actually in San Francisco a few years ago. It was Josh Wolf,
that's right,
this videographer who, kind of classic citizen journalist, and he went to jail for a while, did he not, for refusing? How did that finally get resolved?
I'm not sure how it was resolved. He did go to jail. I don't know how it was resolved in the end. But you're right, that's a good example.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move this on. Let's go back to people like James Risen, who are working for major outlets. What's been dominating our news recently are all these revelations from Edward Snowden, and before that, Bradley, Chelsea Manning. Government leaks, the responsibility or the tendency anyway of the mainstream media to want to report these. Put that in some context for us, because people have come down really hard on Glenn Greenwald, for example. There's this infamous exchange between him and David Gregory on Sunday talk show, where Gregory essentially said, "You're not a journalist, you're a traitor."
Right, right.
And I thought
They say
Greenwald
the same thing about WikiLeaks.
WikiLeaks, yeah.
I think, the larger context is important here, and the larger context concerns the idea of secrecy. It's tempting to see secrecy and freedom as opposites, and they're really not. It's tempting to view secrecy as presumptively wrong, and you see that in the debate now and then, particularly the champions of Snowden and Manning saying secrecy is bad, any effort to get these secrets out, transparency is self-evidently good. And I think it's more complicated than that. I think secrecy is more of a neutral than a presumptively wrong idea. I mean, think of the times when secrecy and freedom are compatible. I mean, think, for example, of the importance we attach to a secret ballot. That secrecy protects coercion. You're less likely to be coerced if people don't know how you're voting, is the idea behind a secret ballot. And it's hard to imagine a government operating without secrets. I mean, think of all the secrets you want the government to protect, you want the government to keep. The secrecy we want the government to keep, we often talk about in the context of privacy. Privacy is an aspect of secrecy. When we say we expect the government to keep our information private, we're saying we expect the government to keep certain secrets about our health records or about our financial records. And we celebrate secrecy when we call it privacy, but it's still secrecy. And we expect the government to maintain certain amounts of secrecy in the private sector. So we turn to the state to protect our private information as it's held by hospitals, for example, or schools. And again, it's secrecy. And so, this current debate about secrecy, I think, is misplaced when we focus on secrecy as something that's inherently or inevitably wrong. I think we need to look at it in a more nuanced, more sophisticated way. I think we also need to appreciate how easy it is to abuse secrecy, and why it's important to distinguish between a state that keeps secrets and a state that keeps secrets about secrets. And it's secrecy about secrecy that's the danger. And that's where I think the Obama administration has got carried away. Not only is there too much secrecy, I mean, you're talking about millions and millions of new secret documents coming out each year, but there are too many people with access to the secrets. I mean, millions and millions of people have access to the millions and millions and millions of documents that are secret. How can you possibly keep secrets under those conditions? It makes a mockery of the idea of secrecy when it's not treated judiciously. And of course, there very, very rarely are there sunshine provisions applied to secrecy, so that we have documents that are still secret from World War II, probably without a compelling justification, although I can't say because it's secret. Part of the problem here is that the policies on secrecy are kept secret, and we're seeing that now with the NSA debate. We didn't even know about some of these programs. So it's important, I think, to distinguish between, the practice of secrecy and particular acts of secrecy. You can make the case that particular acts of secrecy ought to be kept secret. There's no doubt in my mind that troop movement during times of war ought to be kept secret. There's no doubt in my mind. That's a phrase from a Supreme Court ruling in the 1930s about acceptable prior restraint. A newspaper will be punished if they disclose troop movements that jeopardize troops during times of war. And I have no problem with that at all. I would have a problem with secrecy that doesn't talk about what's acceptable secrecy. Let me give you a concrete, everyday, homegrown example. It makes sense for police departments to have radar traps and not disclose the location of radar traps. That's what makes them effective, right? I could see a police department arguing that we're going to have radar traps and we won't disclose the location of radar traps because we want to trap people who are speeding. I can accept that. What I can't accept is a police department that had radar traps and never got public consent for the use of that kind of device. That the use of radar, is subject to public debate. Whether the radar trap is on Charleston and Middlefield is not subject to public debate. And I think we lost that distinction in the debate currently taking place concerning the NSA programs and the FISA court. And in fact, Congress doesn't even know what the FISA court is doing. And we just found out recently that the FISA court decided that several of Obama's, the NSA's actions were unconstitutional. And how could that not be public? How could that not be subject to public accountability, public oversight? It's the absence of accountability that concerns me, and you have a complete absence of accountability when there's secrecy about secrecy.
And a former FISA justice has said there's absolutely nothing we can do about accountability. We don't have the means, the capacity to follow up with the NSA if they're following our orders or not.
And lawyers are in the same bind in Guantanamo. They can't defend prisoners in Guantanamo because the charges against them are secret. Now, I can understand telling a lawyer that you can't disclose this information. I can't for the life of me understand how you could not disclose that to a lawyer and expect any kind of judicial process to be viable and credible.
Yeah. James Risen recently was quoted talking about this sort of thing. I've been an investigative reporter for a long time, and almost always the government says that you can't publish that because of the national security risk when you write a story. And then they never can back it up. They say that about everything, and it's like the boy who cried wolf. It's getting old. That's sort of what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it needs to be explained, and it needs to be explained in public. And now, journalism, I have to say, journalists are part of the problem here, not part of the solution. Journalists keep secrets themselves. Keep in mind when you talk about the debate over shield laws, and you talk about the debate that Risen is engaged in and the New York Times is engaged in, it's secrecy versus secrecy. Right? The press is in effect saying, we want to expose the state's secrets and in the process keep our own secrets. What secrets do they want to keep? Right?
Their sources.
Their sources, the identity of their sources. So here you have journalists embracing secrecy while they condemn secrecy. So there's an irony here that's certainly lost on journalists. Journalists don't see the irony. I don't think most readers see the irony in that either. But there's a larger problem. We find out now and then, and Risen, I think, was involved in one of these earlier examples, the original NSA story, and I think Risen was involved in this back in 2005, that the New York Times broke. When that story came out, we learned, buried deep in the story, after the story jumped inside, was a paragraph that explained that the New York Times had known about the NSA story for over a year and voluntarily withheld it. Voluntarily withheld it. I think Risen was involved in that story. Voluntarily withheld it. Now, there may be good reasons for withholding it. In fact, the Snowden story that was published, the secret budget story that Washington Post just did this week, most of the documents the Post got from Snowden, the Post did not release. The Post did not publish.
They published their own analysis of the documents, but they specifically did not release the documents.
That's right. I think the only documents they published, and I'm not sure how many of the other documents they even summarized. I think it was only 4 or 5 documents they published. I don't know how many documents they didn't summarize at all. Now, my point here is that the Washington Post is no more accountable than the Obama administration. So I'm not at all happy with the Washington Post's coverage until they give us a compelling public justification for withholding that information. We don't find out about secrecy in journalism in the same way, and for the same reasons we don't find out about secrecy in the state, secrecy in government. There's no accountability, no oversight. How many times has the New York Times in any given year or in any given decade agree with the state, cooperate with the state, collaborate with the state, and keep secrets from us? How often does the Washington Post keep secrets from us?
Do we have any idea of the answer to that question?
I don't. For the same reason I don't have any idea how many secrets are in the Obama administration that are under the veil of secrecy.
Because the Post and Times are keeping that secret.
And they're keeping that secret as part of a partnership that journalists don't like to talk about. The collaborative role that the state plays with the press. Now, it's not an argument against that role. It's an argument against not being candid and eloquent in response to questions about that role. So I'm not arguing against that role. I'm not arguing against the Washington Post keeping secrets. I'm not arguing against the Obama administration keeping secrets. I'm arguing against secrecy about that secrecy. All right, when this story came out in 2005 and we learned that the New York Times sat on this story for over a year, the public editor asked the publisher and the editor. The editor at the Times was Bill Keller. Just the questions we're talking about here. why did you sit on it? What were the grounds for sitting on it? What were the grounds for releasing it now? They released it after the election, not before the election. And the response from Keller and the publisher was simply silence. They had no extended response to those good questions from the public editor, which is to say no accountability. We have no public forum in the United States to demand an account from the press. Why? Because of the First Amendment.
In your work on journalistic responsibility and practices, where, I'm not sure how to phrase this, where should an institution like the New York Times or the Washington Post draw a line when they have a story, say the NSA spying story that Risen helped break in 2005, which was almost the same story that Snowden and Glenn Greenwald broke, because it's the same program.
That's right.
8 years later.
Same agency, yeah.
Yep. Where does the newspaper internally draw the line and make a decision when the government comes to them and says, we can't tell you why, but this is really risky to our national security, to the people in this country? How are they supposed to go about making that decision?
I can tell you how they ought to go about making that decision, and it's not an internal decision. It ought to be a public decision. I think the press ought to be as democratic an institution as the state. Keep in mind that the press in the United States is lodged almost entirely in the private sector, which is unlike many Western democracies where there's a substantial press in the public sector. We have virtually no public journalism in the United States. Our support for public broadcasting is embarrassingly non-existent. Whereas in many places in Western Europe, especially the Scandinavian countries, there are heavy subsidies for broadcasting and heavy subsidies for newspapers as well. And there's an expectation of public accountability in that kind of a culture. There's no expectation of accountability in the United States, in part because the press keeps parading out the First Amendment as a justification for the absence of accountability. So, for example, and these are just a couple of glaring examples, of the 1,400 or so daily newspapers in the United States, how many have an ombudsman? Fewer than 30. And of those ombudsmen, how many have a contract that gives them some degree of independence? As far as I know, one, the New York Times. The Washington Post did until a few months ago. They eliminated the position. During budget bad times, it's one of the first positions to go. And in my mind, it should be the last position to go. All right, it's a crucial position. In the United States, we have nothing that resembles a national news council or a national press council of the kind that exists in many parts of the world, especially the Scandinavian countries. A public forum for adjudicating disputes about press practices and performance. Not legal recourse. I'm not suggesting we sue the press when they do something we don't like. I'm not even talking about punitive measures. But I'm talking about a public forum where we can discuss in public, where journalists can get in the habit of justifying in public to the public what it is they do and why they do it, because that's what a democratic institution does. So I want to call the press's bluff. If you see yourself as a democratic institution, then operate democratically. And one of the basic principles of democracy, any kind of democracy, any form of democracy, is accountability, public accountability, not private accountability. So as compelling as the New York Times justifications might be, to the extent that those justifications never leave the newsroom and enter the public sphere, right, they've missed the link between accountability and democratic participation.
And what you described with the public editor at the New York Times can't even get the answer out of her own employers.
So what we're talking about is a change in journalistic culture and a change in American culture as well. There was a National News Council in the United States from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, but it died from neglect, and the neglect was mostly due to the New York Times deciding to pretend that the National News Council didn't exist. It simply declined to participate. And so here you have this national institution with funding from a variety of foundations trying to survive, and the nation's premier newspaper, the newspaper that's based just down the street, won't acknowledge its existence. It was doomed from the beginning. There was a press council in Minnesota for some 30 years, I think, that died a few years ago. that existed for a long time, did some very good work, but it did work mostly behind a veil of secrecy. It was Minnesota's best kept secret. There was a survey done in Minnesota about a decade or so ago asking people what they thought of the Minnesota News Council. Something like 80% didn't even know it existed. So for a news council to exist, it has to be sufficiently public. And the only way it's going to be sufficiently public is if journalists bring publicity to it. How do you bring publicity to it? You cover the news council with the same rigor, the same vigor, the same enthusiasm you cover the state legislature or the city council, rather than waiting for a press release to come out 3 months after the news council deliberates, which is what was happening in Minnesota. And then that press release was buried on page 33, and then we wondered why no one had ever heard of the Minnesota News Council. That's why.
Kind of reminiscent of the New York Times mea culpa about the Iraq story.
Right.
Powerful thing, but it ended up on page 14A. And let's go to our audience, because you've brought up a lot of challenging concepts here, and I think people are going to start thinking about some of these journalistic responsibilities and shortcomings a lot differently. So if you do have a question, raise your hand. Crystal will come to you with a microphone. If you're watching at home, the number should be on your screen, 650-856-1491. Love to have your questions or comments. And if you are in the studio and it's not too much of a burden, please stand up to make it easier for our camera folks. And hold the mic close.
Thank you. It's been very, very interesting. But as you were speaking, I stopped to think, gosh, these newspapers are private enterprise, and they print what they please, and they choose, they select to begin with what they're going to publish, and therefore, and they choose, and the newspapers have a reputation of being a government or a conservative or a liberal, but I'm reading in the Nation that the LA Times is up for sale, and a bunch of other newspapers, maybe to Fox News. And I have to ask myself, well, I would gather from that the news published in that newspaper is sure going to change. And do you have anything to say about that, sir?
Yes. I mean, I think that's an enormously important policy question, and that is, the ownership patterns of American journalism. I think, we talk a lot in the United States about the importance of diversifying the press, creating more opportunities for more voices. And yet that's very difficult to do when the press is owned by a handful of major corporations. And it's not just newspapers, but radio and television and cable. And they're owned by, Ben Bagdickian up at Berkeley has made this point for decades with several editions of his book called The Media Monopoly. And Bob McChesney and his colleague, I'm forgetting his first name, Nichols, has come out with a series of books. John Nichols, yeah. Yes, thank you. They're both coming to Stanford in a couple of months to talk. Really? They both made the point over and over and over again about the importance of diversifying ownership. But that means circumventing the logic and principles of free enterprise. All right, free enterprise means, basically, that Rupert Murdoch can own whatever he wants to own. It's a matter of private property. And Rupert Murdoch would be the first to argue, and now listen to this carefully, Rupert Murdoch would be the first to argue that any limits on his ability to buy the LA Times or the Wall Street Journal, which he already owns, right, or Fox News, which he already owns, or 20th Century Fox, which he already owns, any limit on what he can buy is a violation of his First Amendment rights. Violation of his First Amendment. So how we understand the First Amendment is vitally important. Do we want to understand, do we want to make the case that the First Amendment does not protect the monopoly ownership of journalism? Do we want to argue that the First Amendment protects the right to circumvent the First Amendment? Many Americans, maybe not the Americans seated here, but many Americans believe that public broadcasting is fundamentally undemocratic because it involves state funding of the press. It's fundamentally undemocratic. That the only democratic means of funding journalism is the marketplace, because the marketplace is the only mechanism that's fundamentally democratic. What survives is, by virtue of its survival, the best, the most truthful, the most beautiful. You've heard the logic of the marketplace. So if you're a champion of the marketplace and the model of democracy that coincides with it, a libertarian, laissez-faire approach to democracy, then Rupert Murdoch's argument makes perfect sense. So, you know,
But isn't he, pardon the interruption, but isn't he kind of conflating a couple of things in the First Amendment there, the freedom of press and freedom of speech? Because what he's saying is the newspaper represents his freedom of speech, which is a personal right. And we know that Rupert Murdoch really does use his newspapers to express his own personal point of view. There's just quite a good article in, I think it was the Times on Sunday, about his newspapers in Australia
yes.
dominate the political scene there.
Yeah, oh, and same in England. Yeah, but I mean, Murdoch's position would be, and this is consistent with the position I was taking as well, that when the First Amendment makes reference to freedom of speech and freedom of the press, it's a constitutional redundancy. They don't refer to separate rights. Freedom of the press is simply an illustration of freedom of speech. All right? It's not a separate right. To be a separate right means we have to untangle that morass concerning what is a press and what is not a press. So, you know, Murdoch's position is, you know, in that sense compelling. He's saying, look, I want to be treated like everyone else. No one can tell you how big a megaphone you can have. No one can tell me how big a megaphone I can have. If my megaphone involves owning 300 daily newspapers, so be it.
But haven't there been laws to limit ownership within a certain market?
Only with regard to broadcasting, because broadcasting is subject to very different constitutional scrutiny, because there's a scarcity of airwaves. This is an argument that goes back to the 1920s and 1930s. Broadcasting, interestingly,
it's a limited resource.
Is a privilege in the United States, not a right. No one has the right to have a TV license or a radio license, but it's a privilege given to you by the state in exchange for certain public obligations. We've ignored those public obligations, of course, but...
because you have to use a physical thing, the electromagnetic spectrum.
And the public owns that spectrum.
Right.
Right. But with regard to newspapers, that doesn't apply. So there are no rules concerning, except antitrust laws. And, I mean, the Justice Department hasn't taken antitrust laws seriously in 3 decades, since the Reagan administration. So we could impose antitrust laws, but look what antitrust laws have done with the airline industry or the telephone industry, which is to say virtually nothing.
Okay, wait for the microphone. Go on, head over here.
Well, it seems like we have a media monopoly. 5 large conglomerates own most of the media in this country. And the internet, or the alternative or independent media, is so minuscule that I don't think it poses a threat. How, in a supposed democracy, do we allow this to continue?
Well, you know, we allow it to continue by viewing freedom of the press as a private property right, as opposed to a public obligation, a public right. And again, it's very unusual in Western democracies for that to be the case. If you look across Europe, in France and England with the BBC, for example, most Western democracies take public communication much more seriously than we do in the United States. Historically in the United States, communication has been understood to be an aspect of commerce. When the Federal Communications Commission was created in the 1930s, it was modeled after the Interstate Commerce Commission. Right? Now, if you look at many European countries, communication is understood as an aspect of culture, not of commerce. And so you end up with a very different debate with a very different vocabulary. I remember several years ago I was in Washington, D.C. at a policy seminar where a bunch of academics sat around and listened to policy debates by key policymakers in D.C. And what struck us is that every single policy person who came before the seminar was an economist. Not only an economist, but a laissez-faire economist. It seemed as though to be
best kind.
Right, to be a policymaker in Washington, D.C., you had to have a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. And finally we asked, well, why are you all economists coming out of the Chicago tradition, if not Chicago literally? And their response was very interesting. This was during the heyday of deregulation. And they said, deregulation requires laissez-faire economists. We're the ones who provide a rationale for it. And if you look at the history of policymakers in D.C., it's a history of what kinds of technical questions policymakers can bring to the table. So when the FCC was first created, the questions, the most pressing questions were technical questions, and the key policymakers were engineers. After that, the key question became, what kinds of policies do we need given the answers we were given by the engineers? And so the key policymakers were lawyers. Lawyers made too many laws and too many bad laws and policies, and so Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and a whole bunch of other people decided that
Those are
democracy means laissez-faire, and laissez-faire means deference to the marketplace, and that means we need to bring in Chicago economists who will provide us with a compelling rationale for undoing all that regulation we created in the last 30 or 40 years. Who gets excluded when you define communication in narrowly technical, economic, fiscal terms? Anyone from the humanities. So who never participates in these debates in the United States, unlike the debates in Europe? The poet, the novelist, anyone with an interest in the arts. It would almost seem laughable to ask, and it was laughable at the time of the seminar, to ask, where are the philosophers? Philosophers? What could they possibly have to say about the future of communication? Well, in Europe, they have a lot to say. In the United States, they have virtually nothing to say. And that's unfortunate. That's a very long-winded response to that.
We have a caller on the line, and then we'll get right back to the studio audience. Is our caller Ted still there? Is Ted still on the line? I guess we've lost Ted. Let's go to right here. If you'll stand up.
Yeah. So
Yes.
Oh, hold on. We found Ted. He's
Yeah.
over there in the corner. Quickly, Ted.
Yes. Yes.
What's your question?
Yes.
yes.
I think
Yes.
he's not. I think he's not
Yes.
hearing me.
I was the omnibudsman of Foothill.
I didn't catch that. Did
I
you?
didn't either.
Okay.
Foothill College? I have no idea.
And I been protesting this wars for a number of years, and it's one thing that I wrote about, published for almost 12 years, and it is constant lies, and we need to stop these wars. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the call, Ted. Let's go here in the studio audience.
Yeah, I came into this
Hold
from
it up.
Be the Media point of view, and I came across these people, and they were convinced that palm oil plantations in Indonesia are clear-cutting the habitat of the orangutans, and this it's great for consumers of these goods, but it's really awful for the indigenous way of life. And they felt that this problem wasn't getting enough coverage, you know. So what the people at the table were asking people to do is take stacks of these stickers that say, warning, this product produces orangutan extinction, and take them down to the grocery store and put them on products that had palm oil in them, you know, as a way of spreading the word about what we can not do to solve the problem, you know, just don't buy stuff with this kind of label on it. And I was like, so, like, who's the media in this, you know, and like, does the supermarket have an obligation to let people do this kind of thing? You know, it's really, there's a lot of ways to look at media.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I'm sure the supermarkets would not be enthusiastic about it.
They wouldn't have a laissez-faire
Yeah,
attitude
not
about
at
it,
all.
would they? Okay, let's go here in the audience again.
Obviously, you're a very smart journalist. You understand a lot more than I do. I did not know this is this complicated to have an honest journalism to go on. But my question is that if you decided to make a change in the journalism in the United States, if we to pass a bill or maybe several bills on to make journalism a better system, more organized and more democratic and more honest. And what would be your first bill or first 3 bills you would pass, you would like to pass?
Yeah.
Thank you.
The first one would be the creation of a national endowment for journalism, analogous to the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Arts, although better funded than those endowments which are not taken seriously at all. I would not make the argument against private ownership of the press. I think there are too many privately owned newspapers, for example, that are doing an excellent job. I think the New York Times is a wonderful newspaper. I think the Wall Street Journal does a very good job. So my argument is not against private enterprise. My argument is against only private enterprise, without alternative systems and structures. So I would call for, and other people have as well, legislation that creates opportunities for differences, opportunities for different structures, different systems of journalism. So, for example, a national endowment for journalism could fund publications in communities that don't have the advertising needed to support the kind of daily journalism that we have, that we have in abundance in Palo Alto. I think it should concern all of us that we have abundant high-quality journalism in Palo Alto and very little high-quality journalism in East Palo Alto, right down the street. And that's because there's an advertising market for one and not an advertising market for another. And I can understand why a private press would gravitate toward demographically attractive people, but demographically unattractive people are citizens nonetheless and need to be treated as citizens, and the private sector will not treat them as legitimate citizens. And I think we need to create the conditions for more and better journalism. And I think we can only do that through state intervention. This was an unaskable, if that's a word, an unaskable question 10 or 15 years ago. The idea that can the state play a role in creating the conditions for more and better journalism. But suddenly it's become a credible question. It's become a credible question because so many newspapers are failing.
The changing economics
That's
is
right.
kind of forcing these
Exactly.
questions.
The marketplace for journalism is no longer as viable as it was 15 years ago. Too many newspapers are shrinking in size, too many newspapers are shrinking and disappearing entirely, and we're facing not only a journalistic crisis but a social crisis in the loss of the institution of journalism. That's not to say that individual journalists have disappeared. In many ways, there's never been a greater abundance of high-quality journalism. But the institution of journalism is disappearing, and we need to ask ourselves, how important is the institution of journalism, and what do we want that institution to look like? And if the private sector can't provide that institution for us, do we have the courage to look elsewhere? And I hope we do.
We're starting to see some new models or attempts at models. Trial and error, I think, is a lot what's going on because of the radically changing economic situation of mostly newspapers, but also television news and radio reporting. Outfits like ProPublica or ProPublica, I've never been sure how they pronounce it, which is a nonprofit. They go into alliances with a lot of people. Do you see a lot of hope of this without the government funding, kind of growing organically because of the changing nature of the thing?
Yes, but it's iffy. You have the Center for Investigative Reporting
Right.
As well. I think they're doing excellent work, but they're dependent on foundations.
Right.
And foundations change their mind. You know, the foundation's agenda this year may not be the foundation's agenda next year. I think, you know, the viable alternative to that is an endowment. Now, it may be an endowment funded by foundations, you know, that's fine. You know, but part of what gives Stanford the independence it has is the substantial endowment it has. It's insulated itself from many of these pressures, and I think journalism needs to be funded and structured in a way that insulates it from its sources of funding. You know, I think, you know, public broadcasting works in the United States. I mean, I think all things considered, NPR offers higher quality journalism than any privately owned radio network. And I think part of the charm there, part of the success of public broadcasting in the United States is that money is not given directly from Congress to any station. It's given to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which in turn distributes it to the station so that a disgruntled senator, you know, can't take money away from KQED. You know, it doesn't go directly to Kqed. And I think, you know, we have to think creatively and critically about those alternative structures, what they might look like, so that we can create opportunities beyond the marketplace for the kind of journalism we want. But you know, we need to decide what kind of journalism we want, what kind of coverage we cherish, what kind of coverage we can do without.
Of course, these days, that disgruntled senator would be happy to cut funding for the entire corporation for
That's
public
right.
broadcasting.
And that comes up almost every year. That's right.
That's right. And it's become a favorite kind of whipping boy for anything the right wants to do. Are you seeing any hopeful models along these lines that you do think can survive into the future?
Well, I think they're...
Or are they all based on foundation money, which is...
No, I think there's a good amount based on state money. And I think suddenly we are in the United States looking beyond the United States for answers. There are models elsewhere in the world, but this notion of the United States being so exceptional has prevented us from looking elsewhere. And I think increasingly we're recognizing that others have succeeded where we have failed. And I think journalism is a good example of that. And I think we are looking elsewhere at other models. I think people are thinking creatively. And I think we will see some structural changes in the near future.
That would be great. Where should we look?
Scandinavian countries, I think,
Scandinavian countries.
offer fascinating models. I think Western Europe does as well.
Okay. Our guest has been Ted Glasser, former director of the Stanford Graduate Program in Journalism, professor of communication at Stanford, long list of publications, talking about public journalism and journalistic rights and practices and performance. Be very glad to have you here. Where do you get your news? Do you go online mostly now, or do you still just read the newspaper?
Well, both. I still get the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the San Jose Mercury News of the local newspapers. But then, you know, it's hard not to be online these days.
Yeah, it sure is.
So you get a lot of it. You get your cues from online. So it's a mixture.
And there's a future for journalism?
And I've looked at Al Jazeera recently, too, which is I'm curious to see how that plays out.
I've found that to be a valuable resource. Questionable sometimes, but generally pretty good. You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. We are here live on the first Tuesday of every month. Check your online schedule for rebroadcasts. You will have another 8 opportunities this week and every week this month to see this program. Thanks for joining us. Ted Glasser, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you all for coming.